Hello and welcome to the latest installment in Helix Education's webinar series on COVID-19, the roadmap to fall 2020. And today the topic is student and parent expectation management. My name is Sparky Mortimer. I'm the Associate Director of Creative Strategy here at Helix Education, and I'll be moderating our discussion today. Thanks for everybody who has joined us. Just a couple quick housekeeping items before we get into the meat of the discussion today. We are recording this webinar. We will be posting a link on our Helix Education YouTube page, as well as on a website that we've created with all these different assets related to the new future of higher education. We'll talk about that toward the end of our discussion today. We're also utilizing a service called Otter AI to provide a live transcript of today's webinar. And so you should see in the chat, you should see a link to that transcript if that's something that you would like to take advantage of. We'll also provide a transcript, PDF of the transcript with the YouTube link once it is live, just so you're aware. In terms of the Q&A function, if you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A icon. You're welcome to click that at any time during today's presentation and submit your question. You don't have to wait till the Q&A portion at the end in order to submit a question. If you see something along the way that you're curious about, go ahead and pop that question in the Q&A, and then we'll handle those at the end. We've already gotten a few questions prior to today's webinar, so thanks to everybody who has already submitted some questions for us. So as I said, this is a series as we talk about, this roadmap to fall 2020, and we talk about these different facets. Helix Education, based on our 30+ years experience driving quality online education outcomes for thousands of online students. We've talked about 4 different pillars that make online education a quality transition, a quality experience. And so each week we've been focusing on a different area of those pillars. And so today, this week, we're focused on, again, student and parent expectation management. And I could think of a few people more qualified to talk about this experience than our presenter today, Kari Kovar, our COO at Helix Education. I've worked with Kari for many years, and what makes her qualified to talk about this is just that sense of energy and problem solving. It says there approaches the world with a level of positivity, creativity, can't stop asking what if. And that's where a lot of this has come from, as we've talked about the things that we've done for decades to help make online education a quality experience for students. That has been the driving force behind sharing these assets with everybody and helping everybody to make this transition during a time of crisis. Kari's a higher ed lifer, 2+ decades of experience in lots of different roles within higher ed. And we're in the midst of a challenge, of a crisis right now, but Kari has a great way to turn challenges into opportunities to explore new and novel and exciting solutions, and just helping flip the script on what's possible. And so, Kari, with that, no pressure, but I will let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Sparky. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Here's the deal. We're going to kind of try and keep this moving pretty quickly. And as Sparky mentioned, we certainly will have time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to submit those kind of questions in the chat, and we'll go from there. I thought it would be helpful to give you a little bit of background about kind of my experience and who I am and kind of how I've gotten here, to give you some context. So I started my career 20+ years ago, late 1990s, working for a higher education consulting firm. And I kind of stumbled onto it. My first client was Chico State. And at that time, Chico State, the big kind of story was, were they the #1 or were they the #2 party school in the country? And how should they position that? What does that mean? And so on and so forth. And so I started with Chico State. I have worked with and had the opportunity to work with a number of institutions across the country, from public to private, community college, nonprofit, even some for-profit. And so that's kind of where I started on the kind of marketing, brand strategy, strategic planning. But throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to really kind of navigate around all of higher education. So student success and student support services, instructional design and development. I've helped with, again, strategic planning and advancement capital campaigns. And now I find myself at Helix, where I have the opportunity to kind of have the full student experience from the initial point of inquiry through to the point of graduation in and being able to kind of work with our team to help navigate that and help students find their success. Whatever that might look like and whatever that might mean, whatever modality they might need to have that in, and so on and so forth. The other thing that I think I bring to the table during this kind of time of interesting challenges around us is that I am a mom, and I am a mom that sits in an environment where I have my oldest is going to be a sophomore in college, and my middle, Claire, is going to be a rising senior. And then I've got a freshman, almost sophomore in high school. So as I think about kind of what we do and how we do it, and as I think about student and parent expectation management, I really am thinking about, selfishly, my world. How do I, or what might I hope colleges and universities do, and how might they communicate with my son, who is a current student and looking at the fall, and my daughter, who's a rising senior and considering her options, and then more importantly, how might I hope that you know, colleges and universities would communicate with me as a parent. And so that's a large part of what I kind of bring to the framework, in addition to kind of my historical and kind of, you know, experience in terms of my career. So with that being said, I thought it would be helpful to at least lay the groundwork a little bit in terms of background. But ultimately, here's what I'm trying to do and what I hope we can accomplish today together. So the first is give you a framework for kind of thinking through, how do you manage the student and parent kind of expectations? How do you think through kind of simplifying and implementing an approach that will help to ensure greater success, least amount of risk going into fall 2020. And I'm going to sprinkle in some thought starters. These thought starters are not the end all be all. They're not going to be, you know, there's no silver bullet by any means. But my hope is what it allows you to do is quickly say, oh, we could implement this, and or it may more importantly trigger some additional ideas or thought starters that you can then deploy at your individual institutions. And finally, I really want to make sure that I help kind of reinforce that I truly believe all of you have the tools and the expertise and the creativity to be successful during this time of challenge. And I think that part of what we are already seeing as we've gone through COVID-19 and kind of the implications is that we're finding new ways and new pathways for being thoughtful and intentional, for being creative, for being exceptional problem solvers. And I think that my hope is that's part of what we can kind of work through together today. So with that being said, here's kind of how we're going to structure the conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of the story and what does that mean, and how do we kind of control and or change the story a little bit. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the time on the 4 essentials of expectation management: intentional communication, defining roles and responsibilities. We'll talk a little bit about contingency plans, and then we'll talk about the importance of establishing a feedback loop. And then finally, like we talked about, we'll have Q&A. So with that, let's start with the story. We all know this, that if you don't give them a story, your students and their parents will start to tell their own. Again, I have the luxury, I'm going to call it that, of having a college student that has now living in my basement, going to school online, or just finished up his finals. I have a daughter who's finishing high school and kind of going through that process. And it is funny to me to listen to the stories that they're already saying about this and what's going to happen in the fall. And the reality is they're creating their own stories because there's a level of vacuum. They're not getting kind of the level of communication. And so when we step back from that and we say, okay, there is higher education is ever present. We're seeing it in mainstream media. You'll see it on the Today Show and what's happening with colleges and universities. You see it on the CBS News. There are very big kind of sweeping stories and kind of details that are being shared about the impact that COVID-19 is having on the fall enrollment and the negativity and so on and so forth that could ensue. All of us then also are looking at everything from Inside Higher Ed to the Chronicle to kind of other resources that we use to help guide our decisions, right? Whether it's the associations or it's research, so on and so forth. But there's a whole lot of information that's out there, which again is shaping our story. And in some of those situations, what we're reading and what we're consuming is really overwhelming. It's really kind of, it's concerning. We start to think about worst case scenarios. We lose sight of some of the great things that are happening. And one of the things that I think we need to remember is that the real story of COVID-19 is that all of us, within 2 weeks, completely reshaped and adjusted what had been our traditional undergraduate residential experience to 100% online. It was an emergency remote teaching environment for sure. It was not ideal, but I think we need to be really proud of the fact that we demonstrated that we were absolutely student focused. We were adaptable, we were thoughtful, we were resilient during a time of complete kind of flux and chaos. We were really, really good at problem solving, about thinking through how do we get our students off our campuses? How do we get them to safety? How do we ensure that we are creating a healthy environment? How do we make sure that we're helping our faculty move their courses into an online environment so that they could continue to teach, that we could continue to help students achieve their goals and objectives? That's the real story that we should all be really, really proud of. Because in the process of doing that, all of us lived our brands. All of us demonstrated the values that we have at our various institutions. And I think we have an opportunity to tell that story and to remind our students, whether they're current or prospective students, as well as parents, that this is part of the real story. This is part of the real value. And this is part of what we need to also center them on as we look to the fall of 2020. So with that being said, let's talk about those 4 essentials. Again, intentional communication, roles and responsibilities, and making sure that they're clearly defined, contingency plans, and those feedback loops. So let's jump into the first one. So there's no such thing as over communicating during a time of crisis. We know that, right? We know that all of us crave, right? We probably craved it as employees of our institution. We crave it as members of our communities. We want to know what's going on, and over communicating during this time is more important than kind of holding back and making sure that it's always just very, very meticulous and it's always the right thing. Sometimes it's okay to say, look, we're trying to make decisions as we go, and we're having to adjust and adapt as needed. So with that being said, let's jump into that. So essential 1, communicate intentionally. And again, I think we have to assume that our standard protocols aren't good enough. We can't use those as kind of our baseline. We need to up that level of engagement. So let's talk about location, segmentation, customization, and progression. And what does that mean? So location. All of us, and I think everybody across the country, has created a centralized COVID-19 section, more than likely on your website, right? So that is a location where students and parents can find information about the decisions, the details, the implications that are happening as it relates to COVID, and more importantly, how we're planning for the future. We also have campus alert systems. That is a location that we can leverage and use. We have health center contact information that is more than likely on our websites. We are finding, and I think you know this, right, that more and more students are saying one of the things that they need as they manage through COVID-19, through the summer months, and as they think to the fall, is they need additional support and resources around their mental health. And so think about how can you use, again, your health center contact information, your website, how can you use your general phone number when students call in or when parents are calling? How can you use that as a way to continue to communicate very intentionally about what is happening this week or next week, or what you're doing to plan for the fall? Social media channels and notifications obviously are huge. And I know many of you are already deploying them, whether it's Facebook or Instagram, Snapchat, right, Twitter. Using those social media channels and those notifications become a critical part of how you ensure that the right information is being shared with students and parents intentionally and in a timely manner. So with that being said, one of the things that you may consider, if you haven't done this already, is to think through how can you leverage your student ambassadors. You've got student ambassadors or folks on your campus, maybe they're part of your tour, your admissions tour team, whatever the case may be, that have always been an active part of the community. They've always been an active champion of your brand. They know your history, they know your story. Perhaps you deploy them between now and the fall, and you begin to plant kind of the seeds in the communication with them, and then you ask them to be your student ambassadors in a social media environment. Have them influence kind of the stories and the messaging and the updates, again, through Snapchat, through TikTok if you must, whatever the case may be. Think about how you might use your students as part of your location drivers. In addition to that, more than likely you have parents that are very involved and engaged. What if you were to actually find some parents that are alums of your institution that either have current students or prospective students? Could you use them as part of your distribution of information? Could you use them as part of kind of the communication strategy as you think about the fall? Have them engage with social media, have them engage with maybe some events and things along those lines in a way that really gets ahead of, again, what's going to happen. You tell your story because you're planting it with the right people to be able to distribute it. So location is a really, really important part of it. The other thing that we know to be true, right, is that when you're trying to communicate, segmentation is critical. So it's one thing to think about kind of broad communication to the masses and to everybody that might engage with the institution or have some level of relationship with the institution. But it's also critical, especially during times of kind of turbulence or challenge or when there's some level of uncertainty, to be mindful about segmenting and really think about what are the needs that a prospective student has versus the needs that a current student has, versus what do your faculty and staff and prospective parents need versus current. And so when we think about segmentation, one of the things I would encourage you to do is think about who are the folks on your campus or within your kind of university that may know these audiences most closely. And think about ways that you can sit down, talk to them and say, what are the kind of 3, 4, 5 drivers that we need to know about these individual audiences? And then deploy channels that will start to kind of leverage, right, and really facilitate conversation proactively with those different segments. One of the things that we have done, and we actually do this as a company, and we've shared it with some of our partners and they've started to deploy it, and it's working really well, is about how do you ensure a level of connection when you've got everybody dispersed, right? And you have prospective students that think they want to come in the fall, but if it's online, do I want to be there? Is it of the value? So on and so forth. You have current students that are very much committed to your institution, but they're also finding themselves maybe wondering, like, should I not? Should I stay home? What should I do? What if you were to create some coffee chats between now and the fall, and you think about bringing your prospective students, current students, and some of your faculty or staff together and facilitate conversation. Facilitate conversation around your community. Think about things that really reinforce the value of your brand. Think about things that might be very timely. So perhaps we're getting ready to do registration, and you've got prospective students that aren't quite sure how to go about that process, current students that have already registered and are familiar, and maybe you create a level of buddy system and kind of facilitation in a coffee chat. You include your faculty and staff. You make it a small group environment. It creates and reinforces community, and it gives them an opportunity again to connect with one another, to really reinforce the value of the brand, to make them feel supported and heard and valued, while also giving them an opportunity to make sure that you've got kind of a greater pull and connection. So when the fall comes, regardless of the modality, you're intensifying their level of commitment to the institution, to the program or the major, whatever the case may be, so that they stay with you. Because again, all we're trying to do is make sure, right, that we still end up with the classes that we want in the fall, with our current student and our retention and persistence where it needs to be, to ensure viability for us as an institution from a college or a university standpoint, but that we're also kind of reinforcing that colleges and universities provide more than just the academic, which is incredibly important, but they also create this really unique community and engagement around it. And that's a large part of what segmentation and kind of thinking about how can you do some things creatively might help you do, again, ensuring that you reduce your melt and improve your persistence for the fall. Customization is another really important part of intentional communication. So again, we talked about, the whole idea of sometimes you need to do kind of blast communication to folks, but we also need to recognize and appreciate that not all of us consume, right, messaging in the same way. If you talk to my son or daughter, they Snapchat. I mean, I text them, but their mode of or preferred preference is Snapchat. We might not be at that point yet, right? As an institution, we may not be snapping all the time. And so how do we think about kind of the channels and the way in which we communicate, and making sure that we are thoughtful about the preferences that our students and our parents have given us. More often than not, when your student comes in and they have their LMS, right? The LMS allows them to kind of create a profile which says my preferences for notification and communication is text, and then email, and then discussion or post alerts through the LMS. We can take that learning and that information and use it to our kind of advantage when we think about how do we proactively and intentionally communicate with parents and students. So we should use that. We should think about, okay, how do we leverage, if we know the 18 to 24-year-old market, right, that segment or that student population, whether it's prospective and or current, really likes text, how do we use text messaging as a way to get in front of students to push out the information that we need, and then layer in additional information through other channels, whether it's email or social media, whether it's kind of alerts that are sent out from your LMS or through your emergency alert system. All of those things need to play together. So if you're not in a situation as an institution where you can really be highly targeted with a very particular segmentation and a channel approach, one of the things that I would encourage you to think about is to think about, okay, how do we kind of break this down, maybe in kind of leveraging the system more thoughtfully, intentionally. So if you can't do one-on-one communication and scale that appropriately and effectively, then I would really encourage you to think about text messaging as your way to push out alerts, which again, I'm sure you're already doing this. Then use your email, whether that is your prospective student email, whatever that might be, and or your .edu email, to then expand and provide much more comprehensive kind of information and detail. With that, always driving back to your website and kind of your locations where you've got kind of the bulk of the information, and then leverage social media posts to continue to reinforce and remind your students, both prospective and current, and parents, about what it is you were trying to communicate at the time in which you were communicating it. So again, break it down so that it doesn't become so overwhelming, and think about it in terms of just how do we customize, how do we leverage kind of the tools that are available to us while still ensuring a level of consistency and more than just one stream, but a multi-touch approach. Progression is the whole concept of like making sure that you are continually layering in and adding a level of kind of relevance to the conversation. So the question is, when can your students and parents expect to receive updates, right? There's a level of as we are going through this flux, one of the things that we value, I think it's just human nature, is a level of consistency. And so as we think about progression, what we want to make sure is that we are incredibly consistent, that we are timely, that we are absolutely relevant, right? That we are connecting the dots for folks, that we're also deploying a level of kind of empathy. Because again, there's some challenges that are happening here. We have some of the highest unemployment rates that we've ever had, which may be impacting parents. It may also be impacting students because they can't get the summer job that they used to. That might be what they were using to kind of help fund some of their plans for the fall. And so we need to be empathetic about that. And then we need to be real. I think one of the things that we have certainly seen, and I certainly appreciate as we were kind of, following all of this, is that, the presidents that are talking openly and honestly about this is hard, and we're navigating a time that we've never been in before. But we're trying to do the best that we can, but we recognize that occasionally we're making some mistakes. And so we'll ask for a level of grace and forgiveness as we kind of move forward. And so again, progression, we've got to have the consistency, the timeliness, the relevance, the empathy, and the reality. But then we have the ability to think about the cadence. And this is where I really would encourage you between now and the fall to put together a structure and a schedule for how you are going to communicate. Because again, we're trying to create a level of equilibrium for our students and for their parents. And sometimes the communication may be, we've not made a decision yet, but here's what we're considering, here's what we're evaluating. And so for you as leaders within the institution, as you're trying to make sure, again, that you're stabilizing your melt, that you're maintaining your persistence, and that you're keeping kind of ahead of the parental kind of impact and influence, think about what are those things that you can use to kind of drive daily updates. How might you leverage weekly? Maybe that's your president sending out a video on a weekly basis, and you use that video to, again, provide updates on what's happening around your decisions for the fall. Or maybe it's taking that weekly kind of video and using it as a way to showcase all of the great things that are happening at the institution. And then think about monthly. Perhaps on a monthly basis over the next, 3 months building to fall 2020, maybe you just do a town hall and you have different folks from across your campus join that town hall, similar to what we're doing here. And you have some conversations about hot topics or things that you're doing to prepare for the fall to ensure safety and adaptability. And maybe you share some of the creative and innovative things that you've been doing. And then obviously there's always got to be a scenario where there is on demand. Things that may come out around kind of CDC advisories, or if there are new kind of changes or adjustments to the state policy or restrictions. And so again, think about a calendar. What can you do daily? Maybe it doesn't need to be daily. Maybe it's weekly, maybe it's monthly. And then what do you communicate on demand? And put that level of structure and framework in place. It will help to reduce the stress for you, but it will also ensure a greater level of alignment within your kind of leadership team and within your staff, so that everybody has a level of kind of cadence and pace in which we can kind of operate together. So essential 3 is define roles and responsibilities. And this one to me is absolutely critical. And it's critical, and we'll talk about it in terms of a couple of different ways, but it's critical because I think one of the things that we have to remember, again, while we're kind of navigating the chaos or we're trying to kind of find our new normal, is that customer service, whether we like it or not, is the responsibility of everyone. It is the responsibility of everyone within the institution. And I would argue it's the responsibility of everyone that is connected to the institution, your alums, your donors, your friends. And so let's talk a little bit more about that. So when we think about roles and responsibilities, we think about it kind of in 2 buckets, both internal and external. So what does that mean? And how do we categorize internal? Internal ends up being your faculty, your staff, your leadership. And it means, and the expectation without question has to be between now and the fall, and arguably for the foreseeable future, if it hasn't already been, that they will be available, that they will be timely, that they will prioritize engagement in a very kind of meaningful way, and that when in doubt, they will go the extra mile. Again, we are trying to ensure that we reduce our melt and that we increase our persistence, right? And so we have to go above and beyond. Just like we have to over communicate, we have to go above and beyond in the way in which we interact, and the way in which we engage, the way in which we care and listen to students, whether they, again, are prospective or current, as well as parents, prospective parents or current parents. And so being available means that we pick up the phone. Being available means that if I send you an email, that you respond, and that you respond in a timely fashion within at least 8 hours. 24 hours and 7 days is not acceptable. We've got to be timely and thoughtful to ensure that we're moving in the right direction. So one of the things that we do anytime we have a new employee at Helix, we go through a process and we do training and so on and so forth. But I always share with them what they should expect from us as a leadership team. And the reason I do that is because I think it's only fair that we hold ourselves accountable. And so we say, look, here's what you should expect from us. We're going to be open and honest. We're going to problem solve. We're going to operate with a sense of urgency. We're going to champion accountability. We're going to give you opportunity to grow. We're going to push and we're going to evolve, right? But then in turn, I also always make sure that I'm open about what we expect from them. And the reason I think that's so important is that all of us want to know, all of us want to be successful. Students want to be successful. Parents want to be successful. They want their students to be successful. And so part of what I think we all want to know is, what are you expecting from me? So I think you have an opportunity as an institution to really lead with honesty and openness and accountability around what you expect from your various constituencies and stakeholders. And it is totally fair and appropriate for you to say to your faculty, we need you, and what we expect from you is X, Y, and Z. Just like it is to say, look, we need the advancement team. We need you to do this. And we expect you to do this. Oftentimes this needs to come probably from the leadership, whether that is your cabinet level, the senior leadership team, or maybe it's the leaders within individual kind of departments across the institution. But I think expectation management internally as well as externally is critical. So when we talk about external audiences, they have a responsibility too, right? Prospective students have a responsibility, parents have a responsibility, your current students have a responsibility, and alumni have a responsibility. Just because we on the internal side are behaving or providing a level of customer service doesn't mean that we can't be open and honest with our external audiences about their role as we navigate this new world. And so it is important for us, and I think it is totally fair and reasonable for all of us to be honest and say, look, as a parent, I need you to be an active participant in our community. As a parent of a current student, you helped your student make the decision to come here. They are part of our institution. They are walking kind of experiences, and they create a level of the community. And so we need you as a parent to remind yourself of that and to really reinforce that. We expect you as a parent to find the positive and the opportunity. One of the things that's absolutely fantastic about COVID is that it's not as though we are just, it's not as though one population is being impacted. We're all being impacted. We are all in this together. And so again, we have an opportunity to find the positive. We have an opportunity to demonstrate resiliency and adaptability. We have an opportunity to find new ways and new solutions to maybe some of the challenges and problems that we've had in the past. And I think more importantly, what prospective students, current students, alums, and parents have the opportunity to recognize and appreciate and be a part of in this is that the way in which we're operating today, this is the future. There are very few jobs once you graduate, where you don't have some level of remote interaction, where you don't have some level of kind of engagement that you know has some level of distance to it. And so use this as an opportunity to build those muscles and to build those experiences and to figure out new ways of communicating and engaging. And so roles and responsibilities, I think it's totally appropriate to remind parents that they are part of the shaping of the community, and they are there to help reinforce that good things can come from this new world. And so again, perhaps what you do is you host a webinar, you push out some communication to your parents, you allow them and create maybe a Facebook community where you give them an opportunity to reinforce that this is you as a parent have an opportunity to reinforce that this is a life lesson and this is the real world, and this is a way for us, right, as a community, both the institution and the parents of our students, both prospective and current, to really demonstrate the brand of the university and to show up every day with the values that we believe are so incredibly important and critical. Essential 3, contingency plans. This is a hard one, right? How do you develop a contingency plan when we don't have a perfect scenario or we don't have history to draw from? Well, part of that is you just got to think about what are the sources that you have available to you in terms of the data and the information. And I think it's really, really critical that you make sure that students and parents know what you are using to understand and to make the decisions, and that they understand kind of where your data points are coming from, so they understand the logic. And so from your vantage point, and one of the things I can tell you is that as I think about kind of my friends and kind of their experiences with college students and or high school students, many of them don't know how the colleges or universities are making decisions. And so in that vacuum, then they're creating a story like we talked about earlier. And so push out to your stakeholders, to your students, to your parents, the sources that you're using. Obviously, the CDC is incredibly important. Your state and local government become incredibly important in this. Maybe your accreditor is playing a role, depending on kind of what things they're looking at. You also, as an institution, may be considering, you know, your faculty, a large part of your faculty base have children, and those children don't have daycare centers, and they don't have access to daycare, and so on and so forth. And so that might be impacting some of the decisions that you're making about when and how you're opening back up. And so use that in kind of your communication to stay ahead of it. And I think it's also really fair and appropriate, and again, you have to be mindful, but that you also share that you have to weigh some of the financial inputs and implications. If you are to open back up and you have to reduce all of your student housing, or you have to reduce your class size, and what does that mean from a facility standpoint, all of those things become really important. And so share that information and use that as a way to build consensus and quite honestly, credibility around your next step in terms of the plan. And then as you think about your plan, I think the reality is, and what I'm seeing across kind of the country, is that most every institution is marching forward with the desire to be face-to-face in the fall. And absolutely, I get it, I understand it, and quite honestly, I think students and parents want it, right? And so there is a face-to-face contingency plan, but they're also developing a blended learning contingency plan, and there is also a 100% online contingency plan. And I think what is important is, as you think about how you share that information, share the timeline that you are using to make the decision, share the triggers that you're using to help kind of evaluate which pathway you're going on. And then again, go back and make sure that you reinforce those kind of points that you're using and sources that you're using to influence your contingency plan. The last one is around feedback. One of the things that we are hearing loud and clear, right, is that students and parents want to be able to be engaged in the process. They want to be engaged in kind of what's happening in the decisions that are being made. And so how do you do that in a way that makes sense? How do you manage that in a way that helps you as an institution be proactive and intentional, helps you manage the expectation so that you're not over-promising and under-delivering? And I think ultimately what we want to make sure that we're doing when we establish kind of that feedback loop is that we are creating an environment where we can show and demonstrate that we're empathetic, that we can show and demonstrate that we are truly listening, and that we can show and demonstrate that we're responding. And so what does that look like? It means that when we empathize, that again, we are first seeking to understand, right? That we are putting ourselves in their shoes, that we're being open and honest, that we're sharing kind of some of the emotion, that we're excited about the fall, but we certainly have some, we still have some anxiety about how do we manage all of the logistics and social distancing and so on and so forth. And so when you think about kind of being empathetic and making sure that you're getting those, creating a feedback loop, think about how you communicate and how you ask the questions that you might be seeking to find answers for. Ask questions about how students are feeling and how parents are feeling. Understand kind of the level of anxiety and or excitement. Understand the level of commitment. And it's okay to ask about some of the challenges that they're facing, because there may be challenges that your students and parents are facing that you may not be aware of, that are different than what you are experiencing or trying to manage on the logistical side for the institution. And so ask questions around those types of things, the feelings, the emotions, the challenges. When we listen, what we want to do is we really want to make sure that our stakeholders feel heard. And one of the things I would kind of make sure that you're thoughtful about is that the way in which you ask the question becomes really important in terms of how a student or parent might feel they're being heard, right? And so make sure that you're really asking questions from a variety of perspectives. Make sure that you're asking, again, open-ended questions, but also that you're asking, some yes or no's, and so that you have some clarity. And make sure that you also ask questions that you are willing to do or engage with, depending on the answer. And so again, if there are some things that you as an institution will not do because of details that are related to your institution, don't ask questions that are going to get you into a situation where you're going to be backed into a wall, and or where it's going to create greater tension. So be thoughtful about kind of the way in which you ask questions so that you can listen to the answer and then you can respond. So one of the things that we are certainly seeing, and I think there's been a lot of research and some surveys that we are seeing kind of across the board, but the topics really that seem to be kind of rising to the surface: financial concerns for the students and their families, mental health concerns, as well as physical health concerns. You certainly have some of your students, right, that may have some pre-existing conditions and or would fall into kind of some of those concern areas. And then obviously technology is another one, and modality concerns. And again, some of the modality concerns are perhaps perception related and maybe not always as robust in terms of having concrete examples. But think through kind of some of the topics that you might be able to ask, and maybe the surveys that you could kind of push on or execute, launch, to give you greater insight in terms of how you manage your students coming into the fall and your parents as well. Additional things to really be thoughtful about, and another way to really kind of show that you're listening, is to be open with critique and or praise around your responsiveness and your decision making and the communication that you've had thus far through this kind of process and through kind of this past spring and into the summer. And that also might be a good resource for you if you're trying to kind of manage change within your institution. If you deploy some surveys around kind of the responsiveness, decision making, and communication, it may be a good kind of catalyst for maybe employing better behavior or some new strategies as you go to kind of the fall 2020 and really kind of getting ahead of things so that you can be successful. Again, trying to reduce your melt and increase your persistence. And finally, when you think about responding, you've got to think about, okay, now you've got kind of, you've empathized, you've asked the questions, you've listened and gathered kind of that information. Now you have to respond. And you've got to make sure that you share it with the people that need to hear it and know it. So if you asked a question, you have to give the answer to that question. And obviously you're going to have to prioritize and manage kind of accordingly, but you've got to be thoughtful about the manner in which you do it. And you have to make sure that, again, you deploy those earlier kind of intentional communication skills to really kind of drive this home. And then remind folks that as you're giving them that feedback and as you're responding, share with them their role and responsibility. Be open and honest about what you expect them to do with this. And I think that that's only fair. And I think it also helps them understand, you know, sometimes our answer may be no, we're not going to do this, and here's why. But if you give the rationale and the logic and you're thoughtful and intentional about it, it's much more likely to be accepted. It may not be liked, they may not be doing backflips about it, but they can certainly appreciate and respect it, which I think is critical. So ultimately, at the end of the day, remember this. You do have the ability to kind of control the story and manage the story. And certainly there are always going to be new chapters and new pages that are added to it, but you can curate that. And I think there's some really great things happening in higher education right now. And I think you've got some really great things that you're already doing that you need to kind of share and shape as you think through kind of fall 2020. Be intentional. Make sure that everybody knows their role and responsibility, because if we know our roles and responsibilities, we will operate in that space, and I think we will rise to the occasion. Make sure that you've got contingency plans that are thoughtful, and the reality is you're going to have multiple contingency plans. It's inevitable, but it will help you not only for the fall, but it will help you for future semesters and or terms and or years. And then make sure that you've got an ongoing kind of feedback loop, and be thoughtful about that. Again, if you're going to ask a question, make sure that you're willing to do something with whatever that answer might be. And so be thoughtful about that. Ultimately, though, I think one of the things that I'm most excited about, and one of the things that I think I'm seeing certainly as we get closer to kind of June, as people start to say they're going to make decisions about the fall, is that I have no doubt that we can be successful and that you will be successful. But I think there's some things that we can do now to really lay some good groundwork for the fall. So again, we have our incoming class stays with us, our current students stay with us, and our parents become exceptional champions and ambassadors for us. So with that, did we cover the objectives? Did we share a framework for managing student and parent expectations? We talked about kind of those 4 essentials. My hope is, right, that some of those thought starters give you some kind of ideas that you can use and or might give you some additional things that you might consider. And then ultimately, again, I hope that we were able to kind of reinforce that you really do have the tools and the expertise to be successful during this challenge and during the time of crisis. I think we've already seen that, and we'll continue to see more of that as we kind of move through the summer months and as we get closer to the fall of 2020.
Awesome. Great stuff, Kari. Thanks for everything that you shared. We do have time for a few questions, and so if you joined us a little bit late, that's okay. There's a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You can click that and submit your question. We already have a handful of questions. So Kari, I'll just kind of jump right into it. One question I see here is, we've never had a mass communication strategy before outside of our LMS. How do we start? And there's lots of potential answers to that. Kari, what would you say?
Yeah, so I think here's where I would start. I mean, honestly, I would start by first prioritizing your audiences, right? And I'd like to believe that all audiences are created equal, but the reality is, depending on you as an institution, if you're a tuition-driven institution, you more than likely need to start with your prospective students and your current students. And so think about kind of audience first, and so target audience. in terms of, as you think about your plan and kind of crisis communication, the first thing you need to make sure that you know is the target audience. What makes them tick? What's important to them? What are the drivers that we should be kind of thinking on and making sure that we're reinforcing in our communication? Go to your admissions team or go to your student services or student success team and ask them about those particular audiences. And then once you've identified the audiences, then document kind of the channels in which you're going to communicate. Again, we know that the 18 to 20 plus year old market is first and foremost highly driven by their thumbs, right? So text messaging, email, social media, and use the channels to kind of reinforce, right, with the target audience. And then the other thing I would encourage you to think through is how do you also layer in additional resources across the institution? So how can faculty be of support in kind of that communication and that management? How can your student ambassadors, your recent alums, your grads that have just, this last year graduated, think about kind of how do you bring in additional resources into that crisis communication plan, and then make sure that as you've identified the audience, you've identified the channel, you've identified kind of the key messages and or drivers, and then you identify kind of that fourth area of additional kind of influencers. That's kind of how you think about it. I think that's how you would build the crisis communication plan kind of moving forward, and then make sure that you've got kind of, again, the triggers and or additional resources similar to what we talked about in terms of the contingency plans that you're using to kind of drive the logic and or the flow moving forward.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. We got a question from Ashton. Ashton says, what would you suggest to help with the recruitment aspect of bringing in new students during this crisis? We talked about new and current students and alumni, but specifically for recruiting new students, what would you recommend?
I really think the opportunity that we have right now is to create, and I'm going to call it this, and it may sound a little too elementary, but some level of a buddy system, right? I think that current students are your best path to bringing prospective students in and to keeping those students with you. And I think the reality is your current students have had the luxury of being on campus, and they know what it feels like and the energy. They've had experiences with your awesome faculty. They've had experience with your staff, whether it's in your dining hall, in your residence hall, or the library. Let them be kind of the voice and the champion for the institution, and think through how you can kind of pair your current students with your prospective students. Maybe it's by program and or major. Maybe it's by, a student organization that they're interested in. Maybe it's by region. Maybe you pair people that are in a particular, community together. But think through how you can do that, because the reality is there's not enough kind of admissions folks and maybe even student success folks to be able to kind of manage all of that. But you've got a really large current student population, and I think they want to help. I think that especially when we think about this generation, there's a high level of service and care that they want to give back. And I think this is a great opportunity to really allow them to do that in the current state, and to give them an opportunity to build that level of connection with your prospective students.
All right. Awesome. Thank you. We got a question from Deborah. Deborah asks, what would be a good 101 class for social media and how to use it to create brand influencers? We talked a lot about social media thought starters. Anything you'd recommend in that vein, Kari?
Well, so one of the first things I would say is I would look within your institution. Do you have a communications course and or an instructor that maybe already has some things built around social media? And could you use that as kind of your foundation for creating kind of that social media 101? Or go to your student ambassadors and ask them if they might create a social media 101 and have them, right, teach your team, and then teach those other folks that you decide to be student ambassadors or your social media influencers. And so again, I think the important thing, and you're spot on there, is Some of us might be a little older and may not know or be as savvy with some social media. And so go to folks that do know it, whether it is some of your current faculty, or maybe it's some of your current students, and create a training, right? And then deploy that and do some refreshers. And the reality is that's something you can use not only during the summer months and kind of to the fall, but you can continue to use that in a really meaningful way and scale that for future kind of semesters, terms, and or years.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Deborah, for that question. Probably have time for one more question. Kari, I've got one that says, you recommended reaching students by their preferred channel. What if we don't know what their preferred channel is? What would you suggest?
Yeah, so one of the things I would ask there is, or think about is, there are likely ways that you might know it, and again, it could be that it is in your emergency alert system. They typically ask for preferences, and so it may be there. It could be in your LMS. So again, your IT folks would probably be the first place that I would start to see if they can give you any sort of visibility into it. If you don't have it in your early alert, if it's not in your CRM, if it's not in your LMS, then what I would suggest you do is really, again, deploy a level of stereotype. Again, we know that college students and or high school students, text is probably, well, Snapchat is their #1 preferred channel. But if you as an institution are not going to use Snapchat, which I totally understand, then text is probably the first channel of choice. And then phone is also a part of it, again, depending on what it is you're trying to communicate. Certainly email is very important because again, it's going to give you an opportunity to have more robust conversation and discussion. And then again, social media kind of pushing information out, similar to what we had talked about earlier, but then using that kind of social media to push the information out, but drive them back to those location areas where you've got kind of more of the robust detail is probably pretty important. So again, depending on who you're trying to communicate with, think about kind of the channels that they use. Parents, email, phone, Facebook, right? Instagram, and that's kind of the parental demographic and probably channels there. And then a younger demo is like a Snapchat, an Insta, just text is also really kind of critical and important there too.
All right. Excellent. So before we finally wrap up, first, a big thank you to everybody who attended, and particularly for the questions. Thank you for all the questions that you asked. So just as a reminder, we've been recording this webinar. We're going to post it on our Helix Education YouTube channel, as well as on this website, www.helixeducation.com/new-future. As we mentioned at the top, this is part of an ongoing series of webinars and one of many pieces of content that's available here on this website related to these 4 pillars of transitioning to quality online education. Again, this week we focused on student and parent expectation management, and then we're going to continue to cycle through those pillars in these weekly webinars. And so next week we'll be touching on a topic related to institutional online readiness. So again, just a quick primer on what these 4 pillars are all about. Again, today we talked about that bottom one there, student and parent expectation management, helping to make sure everybody's on the same page, that they understand what this experience is going to be like and the value that is still there. Next week, we'll hit on institutional online readiness. If we could go back just really quick to hit on the pillars there. So again, institutional online readiness, what are those requirements in order to support quality online education this fall? And then in coming weeks, we'll also circle back to talk about the online teaching and learning experience. So creating a great virtual classroom environment and continuing to drive great outcomes for students. And then online student experience and engagement, building that sense of community, that sense of togetherness and involvement, even if students aren't able to physically gather together. And so again, you'll find all of more in-depth information and resources on that helixeducation.com/new-future. What will you find? Underneath each pillar, we've got assessment rubrics, how-to guides, professional development and training, including these webinars, foundational templates and benchmarks and KPIs, all of these assets available for anybody and everybody who wants to make a successful transition as an institution for fall 2020. Again, that's helixeducation.com/new-future. future. So once again, thanks to everybody who joined us today. Thank you very much, Kari, for sharing your expertise with us. Thanks for all the questions that we submitted. And we know that there may be additional questions that you have or additional follow-up. Here's Kari's contact information right there, kkovar@helixeducation.com. You got her phone number right there. And then once more, for this and a whole bunch of other resources that are available to you to help you with this transition, there's the website again, helixeducation.com/new-future. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Have a great rest of your day and week. Take care.
Thank you.